Valdris 9 had two settings, actively hostile and passively trying to kill you. Marcus Webb had been stationed on the planet for 4 months, and he developed a healthy respect for both modes. Currently, the weather was gearing up for actively hostile, which meant the electromagnetic storm warnings were lighting up his monitors like a very aggressive Christmas display. He stood in his shelter's main room. Calling it a room was generous. It was more like a reinforced box with delusions of architecture, and ran through pre-storm protocols with the efficiency of someone who'd done this too many times to find it exciting anymore. Secure external equipment. Check. Reinforce electromagnetic shielding. Check. Make sure the emergency rations weren't expired. Also check, though expired was a flexible concept when the nearest supply run was 3 weeks away. The shelter was dug into a cliff face overlooking one of Valdris 9 crystal forests, massive formations that grew like trees made of prismatic minerals and sang in harmonics during electrical storms. Beautiful, deadly, and absolutely not worth being outside for when the weather decided to throw a temper tantrum. Marcus's job, officially, was geological surveying for the Colonial Expansion Initiative. Unaffectively, it was professional isolation in conditions that made harsh sound like understatement. He cataloged mineral deposits, monitored seismic activity, and tried not to think too hard about how the nearest human was Administrator Chen back at Forward Station, and she was 3 weeks of rough terrain away even when the weather cooperated. The planet's native inhabitants, the Valdrani, made isolation an art form. They were bipedal, technologically sophisticated, and deeply committed to avoiding human contact with the kind of determination usually reserved for dodging social obligations. Marcus had seen them through survey equipment. Tall, slight figures moving through the crystal forests with the grace of people who belong to the landscape in ways humans never would. Their architecture integrated into the natural formations, crystalline structures that looked grown rather than built. Official contact protocols existed, complicated documents about respecting cultural boundaries and maintaining appropriate distance, but Marcus had never needed them. The Valdrani kept to their territories, humans kept to theirs, and everyone maintained the polite fiction that this was sustainable long-term diplomacy rather than mutual avoidance. His communication array crackled with static, electromagnetic interference building as the storm approached. Marcus switched to local systems only, knowing that for the next several hours he'd be cut off from even radio contact with Forward Station. Just him, his shelter, and whatever entertainment he could derive from monitoring geological data while wind that could strip paint off metal tried to relocate his home. He'd gotten good at isolation. Not enjoyed it good, but developed coping mechanisms that looked like competence good. He kept detailed logs, maintained rigorous schedules, and only occasionally talked to himself like he was narrating a nature documentary about a particularly boring species. The human approaches the coffee maker in his natural habitat, he muttered, pouring the last of his morning brew into a cup that claimed to be thermally insulated but was lying. Note the desperate expression, the unkempt hair, the general aura of someone who chose this assignment voluntarily and is questioning that decision during every storm. The wind picked up outside, creating harmonics through the crystal formations that sounded like the planet was tuning an orchestra. Marcus sealed the interior door, checked the atmospheric pressure readings, and settled in for the long wait. Storms on Valdris 9 lasted anywhere from 6 hours to 3 days, and this one was registering as significant on the meteorological scale that ranged from annoying to genuinely concerning. He pulled up survey data on his workstation, determined to be productive despite the fact that his brain was already sliding into the particular boredom that came from being trapped in a small space with nothing but his own thoughts for company. Outside, the sky turned purple with electrical discharge, and the crystal forests began their storm song, harmonic resonance that was beautiful and slightly ominous, like listening to a choir that might be planning your demise. Marcus was 3 hours into reviewing mineral composition analyses and seriously considering whether talking to his coffee maker counted as maintaining mental health when something hit the exterior door with enough force to make him jump. His first thought, debris. The storm could pick up crystalline fragments and throw them hard enough to dent reinforced steel. His second thought, when the pounding came again, rhythmic and desperate, was that he might be hallucinating from isolation. His third thought was interrupted by more pounding, accompanied by a sound that definitely wasn't wind or debris, but might be a voice if voices could be heard over electromagnetic chaos. Marcus moved to the door's monitor, but the external cameras were already offline from interference. The pounding continued, increasingly frantic, and he made a decision that was either humanitarian or monumentally stupid, possibly both. He opened the door. Wind hit him like a physical force, carrying stinging crystal particles and rain that felt more like being attacked by liquid than experiencing weather. In the doorway, collapsed against the entrance, was a figure that was definitely not human and definitely not supposed to be here. Valdrani, female, based on what little he knew of their physiology. Tall, even crouched, with limbs that seemed too long for her frame and the characteristic elongated ears that gave the species their distinctive silhouette. Her clothing was torn, scorched from electrical burns, and she was shaking from either cold or shock or both. Marcus didn't waste time on questions. He grabbed her arm careful, aware that his human strength might be too much, and pulled her inside. She stumbled across the threshold, and he sealed the door behind her, cutting off the wind's scream and the storm's violence. The sudden silence was almost loud. Marcus turned to find the Valdrani woman pulling herself upright with visible effort, her large eyes, adapted for Valdris 9 dim light, struggling to adjust to the shelter's interior illumination. She was taller than him, maybe 6'2", with proportions that looked fragile until you remembered this species had evolved on a planet that considered survivable a challenge rather than a baseline. She looked at him directly and her entire body went rigid. Not fear. Marcus had seen fear in enough species to recognize it. This was something else. Shock, maybe, disbelief. Like she was seeing something that violated fundamental assumptions about reality. They stood frozen in the shelter's entrance area, water dripping from her clothing, wind still hammering the exterior door, and the particular awkwardness that comes from having absolutely no idea what to do next settling between them like a third presence. Marcus raised his hand slowly, palms out, in what he hoped was a universal gesture of non-threat. "You're safe here," he said, keeping his voice calm and level. "The storm can't reach us." She didn't respond, just stared at him with an intensity that made him acutely aware of every human feature that must look wrong to her. His forward-facing predator eyes, his flat face, his stocky build compared to her elongated frame. He was probably as alien to her as she was to him, except he'd at least seen Valdrani through survey equipment. She'd walked into a human's shelter and gotten her first up-close look at something that shouldn't exist in her daily reality. The storm continued its assault outside, and Marcus had the distinct feeling that the weather was the least complicated thing either of them would have to weather tonight. The silence stretched like overwound string about to snap. The Valdrani woman swayed slightly, caught herself, and Marcus realized she was probably injured beyond what was immediately visible. He gestured toward the shelter's small medical station, a corner with emergency supplies that he desperately hoped worked on non-human biology, and spoke slowly. "You're hurt, let me help." Her eyes tracked his movement toward the medical supplies with the focus of someone evaluating threat level. Marcus moved deliberately, keeping his hands visible, pulling out the basic first aid kit that forward station protocols required him to maintain. Bandages, antiseptic, wound sealant, pain medication that probably wouldn't work on Valdrani biochemistry, but was better than nothing. He pointed to her arm, where her torn clothing revealed a cut that was bleeding something not quite red but close enough to trigger his "stop bleeding" response. Then he held up the supplies and waited. She looked at the medical kit, at him, at the sealed door keeping the storm outside. Her ears, those long, delicate structures that seemed to rotate independently, moved in ways that probably communicated something in Valdrani body language but that Marcus couldn't interpret. Finally, she extended her injured arm with the wariness of someone accepting help from a potentially dangerous source. Marcus cleaned the wound with antiseptic, trying to be gentle while also being thorough. The Valdrani woman watched the process with intensity that suggested she was cataloging every detail of human medical practice for later analysis, or possibly to determine if he was secretly trying to poison her. He applied wound sealant, a spray-on bandage that had saved him from numerous minor injuries, and stepped back to give her space. She examined the bandage, her long fingers probing the edges with delicate precision. Then she looked at him and spoke for the first time, her voice carrying harmonic overtones that made it sound like two people speaking in synchronized pitch. Marcus caught exactly none of it, a flowing string of syllables in a language his translator would normally handle, but currently couldn't because the electromagnetic interference had killed all non-essential systems. He gestured to the translator unit on his wrist, shook his head apologetically, and was rewarded with an expression that transcended species barriers: universal frustration at technology failure during critical moments. They resorted to the communication method that predated language, pointing, gesturing, and expressive looks that conveyed meaning through context. Marcus pointed to himself. "Marcus." She tilted her head, repeated the sound with difficulty, the hard consonants clearly not natural to Valdrani vocal anatomy. "Marcus." "Close enough," he nodded encouragement. She pointed to herself, spoke a word that sounded like wind through crystals. "Sereth." "Sereth," Marcus repeated, probably mangling the pronunciation but trying. Her ears rotated in a way that might have been approval or might have been resigned acceptance that humans were going to butcher her language and she'd have to live with it. She gestured to the storm still raging outside, then to herself, making a motion that Marcus interpreted as traveling, followed by pointing to his shelter with what looked like gratitude or possibly desperation. So she'd been caught in the storm while traveling, sought shelter in the only structure within reach, and ended up in a human survival module, having what was probably her first close encounter with a species she'd been avoiding her entire life. Marcus could relate. This was definitely not how he'd expected his evening to go either. He showed her the shelter's amenities through gesture and demonstration. The food storage, the water reclamation system that made Valdris 9 mineral-heavy precipitation into something drinkable, the sleeping area separated by a privacy screen that suggested Forward Station's designers understood that isolation was one thing, but lack of privacy was psychological torture. Marcus pulled out emergency rations, held up 2 different types, and raised his eyebrows in question. Sereth examined them with the wariness of someone who had no idea if human food was edible to her species, but was hungry enough to risk it. She selected one, and Marcus took it as a win that she hadn't immediately rejected everything he offered. They sat in the shelter's main room, him in his desk chair, her on the floor because his furniture wasn't designed for Valdrani proportions, and ate in awkward silence interrupted by the storm's continued violence. Marcus tried not to stare, but it was difficult when she was the first non-human he'd interacted with at close range in 4 months. Her ears moved constantly, tracking sounds with precision that suggested hearing far beyond human range. Her eyes, large and dark, reflected light like an animal's, adapted for the planet's natural dimness. She caught him staring, and Marcus felt his face heat with embarrassment. But instead of offense, Sereth seemed curious, leaning forward slightly to examine him with equal attention. She reached out slowly, her long fingers hovering near his face, and Marcus held very still, not sure if this was some cultural gesture or if she was about to poke him in the eye. She touched his cheek gently, her expression suggesting fascination mixed with confusion. Her fingers traced his jawline, and Marcus realized she was mapping the differences between human and Valdrani facial structure. Fair enough, he'd been mentally cataloging her features since she arrived. Seemed only reasonable to let her do the same. The universal translator chose that moment to flicker to life, offering fragments of translation before dying again. Sarith pulled her hand back, spoke, and Marcus caught partial meaning through the choppy signal. Never seen, so close. You are static, different than stories. The translation cut out, but Marcus got the gist. She'd never encountered humans up close, and reality was different from whatever stories her people told. He knew the feeling. Human settlements told plenty of stories about the Valdrani, most of them variations on hostile natives who attack without provocation. He gestured to himself, then to her, made a motion like talking, and raised his eyebrows hopefully. She seemed to understand, nodding with her whole upper body in a gesture that was probably the Valdrani equivalent. They spent the next hour in halting communication, part gesture, part drawing on his data pad when words failed, part waiting for the translator to offer brief windows of actual language. Marcus learned that Sarith was a surveyor, same as him, documenting geological formations for her people. They were doing the same job on the same planet, maintaining careful distance because their respective cultures insisted that was proper protocol. She'd been traveling to a research site when the storm intensified beyond predictions. Apparently Valdrani weather forecasting wasn't perfect either, and sought his shelter because it was the closest structure and she was desperate. Seeing a human up close was shocking because Valdrani cultural practice involved maintaining distance from other species, a tradition rooted in ancient conflicts and maintained through generations of careful separation. Marcus found himself explaining through gesture and broken translation fragments that he'd been alone for months, that this assignment was voluntary, that some humans actually chose isolation. Sarith's expression suggested this was almost more alien to her than his appearance. Her people valued community highly, and voluntary solitude was considered either punishment or eccentricity. The storm showed no signs of diminishing. If anything, the wind was getting worse, and Marcus's equipment registered this as one of the more significant meteorological events since his arrival. They were going to be trapped together until it passed. Two people from different species forced into proximity that violated every cultural protocol either of them had been taught. Sarith settled against the shelter's wall, her long frame folding in ways that looked uncomfortable, but that she seemed to accept as normal. Her eyes were starting to close, exhaustion catching up with adrenaline, and Marcus realized she probably needed sleep more than continued awkward communication attempts. He gestured to the sleeping area, offered it to her through exaggerated pantomime. She shook her head, pointed to him, then to the sleep area, suggesting he should rest and she'd stay in the main room. They went back and forth in silent negotiation until Marcus dragged out his emergency sleeping pad and offered it as compromise. She could have the floor with padding, he'd take his usual space, and neither of them would have to feel guilty about taking resources from the other. Sarith accepted with visible relief. As she settled onto the sleeping pad, her eyes met his, and the translator offered one brief, clear translation. "Thank you for not being what I was taught to fear." Then the signal died again, and Marcus was left in the semi-darkness with a Valdrani surveyor sleeping in his shelter, while a storm tried to destroy everything outside. He settled at his workstation, pulled up logs that needed updating, and stared at the interface without seeing it. First contact protocols had definitely been violated, but looking at Sarith, exhausted, injured, trusting him enough to sleep in his shelter, Marcus couldn't bring himself to care about the paperwork this would generate. Sometimes survival meant accepting help from unexpected sources, even when those sources challenged everything you'd been taught about the universe. Outside, Valdris 9 continued its assault. Inside, two survivors from different worlds found unexpected common ground in the simple act of weathering the storm together. Marcus woke to unfamiliar sounds, soft harmonic breathing that wasn't quite snoring but wasn't quite silence either. It took him a disoriented moment to remember why there was a Valdrani woman sleeping in his shelter, and another moment to check his monitors, and confirm that the storm was still raging with the enthusiasm of weather that had personal grudges to settle. Sareth was still asleep on the emergency pad, curled in a position that looked profoundly uncomfortable to human anatomy, but that she seemed perfectly content with. Her ears moved even in sleep, tracking sounds with the unconscious precision of predator awareness or maybe just really good hearing. Marcus tried to move quietly, but the shelter was small enough that quietly was a relative concept. Sareth's eyes opened immediately, no gradual waking, just instant alertness that suggested sleep was a luxury rather than a vulnerable state. She looked at him, at the shelter's interior, and her expression cycled through confusion before memory apparently caught up with consciousness. He held up the coffee maker in question, raising his eyebrows. She tilted her head, clearly not understanding, so Marcus pantomimed drinking, pointed to himself, then to her. Universal offer of morning beverage to unexpected guest. Sareth nodded with that full-body gesture, and Marcus started the coffee maker that had survived 4 months of Valdris 9 and deserved some kind of medal for continued service. He had no idea if Valdrani could process caffeine, or if he was about to accidentally poison his first alien contact, but she'd eaten human rations last night without immediate distress, so he was willing to risk it. The translator flickered to life as electromagnetic interference temporarily diminished, offering Marcus a window of actual communication. Storm duration unusual. Sareth's voice came through in accented but comprehensible human standard language. My people will be concerned, cannot contact. Same, Marcus replied quickly before the translation window closed. The storm's blocking communications. We're cut off until it passes. Sareth absorbed this, her ears rotating in patterns that probably meant something in Valdrani body language. How long? Could be hours, could be days. Valdris 9 doesn't follow predictable patterns. The translator cut out, returning them to gesture-based communication. Marcus handed her coffee that was probably too strong for human consumption, and definitely an unknown quantity for alien biology. Sareth took it cautiously, inhaled the steam in a way that suggested smell was important to her species, and took a careful sip. Her expression was difficult to read, but she didn't immediately spit it out or show signs of distress, so Marcus took it as a qualified success. Pulling up geological surveys on his monitors. She leaned in with immediate interest, and the translator offered fragments of excited commentary about formations she'd documented from different angles, about shared observations of the planet's unusual crystal structures. They were doing the same work, Marcus realized. Documenting the same planet, studying the same geological processes, maintaining separate databases because their species couldn't cooperate directly. The inefficiency was almost comical. 2 surveyors literally studying identical formations while carefully avoiding each other because ancient cultural conflicts insisted that distance was safer than cooperation. The storm continued through the day, and the translator's intermittent function created a strange conversation pattern. Bursts of actual dialogue interrupted by long stretches of gesture and context-based guessing. During one clear window, Sareth asked the question Marcus had been expecting. What will you tell your people about this? Marcus considered his response carefully. Honestly, probably nothing. The paperwork for unscheduled first contact would be extensive and annoying. Sareth's laugh transcended translation, a sound that was musical and genuine, and suggested she appreciated bureaucratic rebellion on a universal level. The same, my supervisors would require detailed reports, cultural sensitivity reviews, approval processes. She paused. Easier to call it storm delay, not mention the human who saved me. I didn't save you, just offered shelter. In my culture, shelter during storms is sacred obligation. You could have refused, feared contamination or danger. You opened your door to a stranger from a species you've been taught to avoid. The translator was working well enough that Marcus caught the full meaning. That is saving, even if you don't name it so. They talked in fragments throughout the day, about their work, their isolation, the strangeness of being alone on a planet that actively tried to kill inhabitants on a regular basis. Sareth admitted that Valdrani culture valued community highly, but respected the choice to serve in remote locations, though it was considered eccentric bordering on concerning. Marcus explained that human culture had a long tradition of exploration isolation, that choosing frontier assignments was seen as brave or foolish depending on who you asked. Which are you? Sareth asked during a moment of clear translation. Brave or foolish? Probably both. I wanted to see things no one else had seen, document the unknown. He gestured around the shelter. Didn't fully account for the part where unknown includes being alone for months at a time in conditions that make Earth's deserts look friendly. Earth's deserts, Sareth repeated the words carefully, my homeworld. Mostly water and moderate climate, but with regions of extreme dryness. Nothing like Valdris 9 storms, though. Valdris 9 is temperamental, Sareth agreed. My people have lived here for generations, and we still consider the weather a personal opponent rather than environmental condition. They shared a smile at that. Universal recognition that complaining about weather transcended species barriers. As the second night approached, the storm finally began to diminish. The electromagnetic interference decreased, and Marcus's communication systems flickered back to life, with priority messages from Forward Station demanding status updates and expressing concern about his prolonged silence. He'd have to respond soon, create some plausible explanation for being offline that didn't involve unscheduled alien houseguests. Sareth watched him work with the intensity of someone cataloging every detail. You'll be able to contact your people soon. Yeah, they'll be relieved I'm not dead, annoyed that I worried them. He paused. You should be able to contact yours too, once the interference clears completely. Yes. She didn't sound entirely happy about this. I will have to explain the delay, account for time lost. They both felt it, the weight of the approaching end, the recognition that this strange interlude was temporary. Soon Sareth would leave, return to her survey routes, and Marcus would return to his isolation. Their encounter would become memory rather than present reality. What will you tell them? Marcus asked. Really? Sareth was quiet for a long moment, her ears rotating in patterns that suggested deep thought. That the storm was worse than predicted, that I found shelter and survived. She met his eyes directly. That maybe maintaining distance costs more than risking closeness. That stories about humans don't account for individuals who offer shelter without asking for payment or advantage. I'm not sure one human offering coffee counts as evidence against cultural narratives. No, Sareth agreed, but it's a data point, an observation that doesn't match predicted patterns. In surveying, we call that significant finding worth investigating further. The translator was working perfectly now, and Marcus caught every nuance of what she wasn't quite saying. That this encounter mattered, that maybe the careful separation between their species was based on outdated information. That individual interaction revealed complexities that official protocols failed to account for. The storm cleared completely by morning, leaving Valdris 9 crystal forests glittering in post-storm light that made everything look newly created. Sareth prepared to leave, her injuries healed enough for travel, and Marcus helped her gather the supplies he'd offered: rations, water, a backup communicator in case she ran into more weather trouble. They stood at the shelter's entrance, looking out at the transformed landscape, and Marcus realized he'd gotten used to having someone else in his space. The shelter felt emptier than it had before she arrived, and the isolation he'd accepted as normal now carried weight it hadn't possessed previously. Sareth seemed to feel something similar, hesitating at the threshold as if leaving required more effort than arriving had. She spoke without waiting for the translator, her words incomprehensible but her tone suggesting gratitude, connection, recognition of something shared. Marcus responded in kind, hoping that tone conveyed what words couldn't. "Safe travels, Sareth. Try not to get caught in more storms." The translator offered her response. "Try not to stay alone so long that you forget others exist, Marcus." She managed his name better now, the pronunciation closer if still slightly musical in Valdrani accent. She left, moving through the crystal formations with the grace of someone who belonged to this landscape in ways Marcus never would. He watched until she disappeared into the glittering forest, then returned to his shelter that suddenly felt too quiet and too empty. His communicator chimed with messages from Forward Station. Administrator Chen demanding immediate status update and threatening paperwork if he didn't respond promptly. Marcus sat at his workstation, stared at the interface, and decided some encounters didn't need official documentation. He filed a standard storm delay report, mentioned equipment damage and communication loss, made no reference to alien visitors or unscheduled first contact. Some things were too significant for bureaucratic records, too personal to reduce to official language and protocol violation categories. Outside, Valdris 9 returned to its normal state of beautiful hostility. Inside, Marcus adjusted to solitude that now carried the memory of temporary companionship, of a Valdrani surveyor who challenged every assumption he'd maintained about the careful distance between species. He pulled up his geological surveys, returned to work that felt simultaneously important and irrelevant. Somewhere in the crystal forests, Sareth was doing the same, documenting the same planet from a different perspective, maintaining the careful separation that their cultures insisted upon. But Marcus kept his backup communicator set to emergency channels and found himself checking it more often than necessary, just in case another storm forced unexpected shelter, just in case isolation broke down barriers that protocol maintained, just in case connection formed accidentally was worth maintaining deliberately, one cautious communication at a time. The crystal forest sang in the wind, and Marcus got back to work, alone but no longer quite as isolated as before. 3 days after Sareth left, Marcus's work routine had returned to normal, or what passed for normal when you were alone on a planet that considered habitability a flexible concept. He conducted surveys, maintained equipment, and absolutely did not check his emergency communicator every time it made any sound whatsoever. That would be irrational behavior, suggesting he was hoping for contact from a Valdrani surveyor he'd met for less than 48 hours. His official communicator chimed with a priority message from Forward Station. Administrator Chen's voice came through with the particular tone that suggested paperwork was about to ruin his day. "Webb, we're showing unusual seismic activity in your sector. Nothing dangerous, but outside normal parameters. I need you to check the northern crystal formations, about 15 kilometers from your position. Recent storm activity may have destabilized some structures." Marcus acknowledged, gathered his survey equipment, and headed out into Valdris 9 version of a nice day, which meant merely difficult rather than actively trying to kill him. The northern formations were spectacular even by the planet's standards, crystalline towers reaching hundreds of meters high, growing in fractal patterns that suggested mathematics made manifest in mineral form. He was setting up seismic monitors when his emergency communicator crackled to life. Not distress signal, just someone transmitting on a frequency that technically wasn't supposed to be used for casual communication. "Marcus, this is Sareth. I hope this channel is appropriate for non-emergency contact, though our culture's definitions of emergency may differ." Marcus grabbed the communicator fast enough to nearly drop it. "Sareth, is everything okay?" "I am well, better than well." Her voice came through clearer than during the storm, the translator handling the conversion smoothly now. "I am conducting surveys in formations approximately 20 kilometers from your position. I thought, if you were available, perhaps collaboration would be more efficient than maintaining separate documentation of identical geological features." Marcus looked at his seismic equipment, at the crystal formations glittering in the light, and felt something settle in his chest that he hadn't realized was unsettled. "Collaboration sounds extremely efficient. Forward Station wants me to check northern formations anyway. If we happen to share data, it would save both our organizations valuable resources," Sareth finished. "My supervisors need not know the data came from joint observation rather than separate efforts. Bureaucratic efficiency through strategic information omission. I like how you think." They arranged to meet at a midpoint, a crystalline plateau that offered clear sightlines and was roughly equidistant from their respective positions. Marcus arrived first, setting up equipment with the efficiency of someone who'd done this hundreds of times. He told himself this was just practical cooperation, that sharing data made sense, that his heart wasn't beating faster because he was about to see Sareth again. He was lying to himself, but at least he was self-aware about it. She arrived with the grace that came from a lifetime on Valdris 9, carrying Valdrani surveying equipment that looked simultaneously more advanced and more organic than human technology. Her injuries from the storm had healed completely, leaving no visible trace of the desperate figure who'd pounded on his door days ago. "Marcus," she greeted him, and he noticed she'd practiced the pronunciation. It was nearly perfect now. "Your formations are as impressive as mine, perhaps more so." "They're the same formations. We're just looking from different angles." "Yes, which is exactly my point." She moved to his seismic monitors, examined them with scientific interest. "Your equipment measures ground resonance, records frequency patterns." "Yeah, trying to predict structural instability before it becomes catastrophic failure." He gestured to her equipment. "What's yours measure?" "Crystalline growth patterns, harmonic response to environmental stress. Different methodology, complementary data." She set up her equipment alongside his, and they worked in comfortable silence that suggested this wasn't the first time they'd collaborated, even though it absolutely was. They spent the afternoon conducting surveys that were legitimately useful and definitely not an excuse to spend time together. Sareth's equipment revealed growth patterns Marcus's couldn't detect. His seismic data provided stress measurements hers missed. Together, they built a more complete picture of the formations than either could have achieved separately. During a break, both of them sitting on a crystalline outcropping, sharing water and rations, Sareth asked the question Marcus had been wondering himself. "Why did you respond to my communication? You could have ignored it, maintained professional distance as protocols suggest." Marcus considered his answer carefully. "Because the storm showed me that maintaining distance is easier than building connection, but connection is more valuable. Because I spent months alone and then spent one storm not alone, and the difference was significant." He paused. "Because you called and I wanted to answer." Sareth's ears rotated in patterns that Marcus was learning to read. This one seemed to indicate pleased surprise mixed with relief. "I was uncertain about contacting you. My culture values community but maintains suspicion of outsiders, especially humans. Making direct contact contradicts training, violates social expectations." "But you did it anyway." "But I did it anyway," she agreed. "Because you showed me that stories about humans, about aggressive colonizers who see us as obstacles rather than people, don't account for individuals who offer shelter without demanding payment, who share resources without expecting advantage, who treat first contact as opportunity for connection rather than conflict. I'm one person, not representative of all humans. And I am one person, not representative of all Valdrani. She looked at him directly, her large eyes catching the light. But individuals are how understanding begins, yes. One connection at a time, until enough connections exist that separation seems more strange than cooperation. They worked until the light began to fade. Valdra's 9-day cycle was shorter than Earth's, requiring adjustment, and prepared to return to their respective shelters. Before leaving, Sareth transmitted her survey data to Marcus's equipment, a gesture that was probably against multiple protocols but felt right anyway. "Will you contact me again?" Marcus asked, trying to sound casual and definitely not succeeding. "For more collaborative surveys, I mean, purely for scientific efficiency." Sareth's expression suggested she heard everything he wasn't quite saying. "Yes, for scientific efficiency, and because isolation becomes heavier once you've experienced alternative." She hesitated, then added, "My people have a saying. The storm brings gifts as often as destruction if you're willing to open your door." "I am willing, Marcus, are you?" "Yeah," Marcus said, feeling like something significant was being acknowledged between them. "Yeah, I'm willing." Over the following weeks, they developed a pattern. Coordinating surveys, sharing data, meeting at midpoints between their territories to conduct joint observations that were absolutely about scientific collaboration, and definitely not about two people who'd accidentally discovered that connection was better than isolation. They communicated regularly via emergency channels repurposed for decidedly non-emergency conversation, sharing observations about geology and weather, and the strange experience of choosing cooperation over culturally mandated distance. Administrator Chen noticed the improvement in Marcus's survey quality, commenting that his data was unexpectedly comprehensive and wondering if the isolation was making him more focused. Marcus agreed vaguely and continued strategically omitting the part where his comprehensive data came from collaboration with a Valdrani surveyor. Sareth faced similar questions from her supervisors, deflecting with technical language and careful omission. They were both violating protocols in service of something neither could quite name. Not quite friendship, not quite professional collaboration, but something that mattered enough to risk bureaucratic complications. One evening, during a survey of formations near Marcus's shelter, another storm rolled in, not as severe as the one that had brought them together, but enough to require immediate shelter. This time when Sareth arrived at his door, there was no desperate pounding, no surprise, no shock at seeing each other. Just Marcus opening the door before she knocked, both of them moving efficiently through shelter protocols like a practice team. They sat in the main room, now equipped with Valdrani-appropriate seating after Marcus had improvised modifications, and shared a meal that combined human and Valdrani rations in combinations that shouldn't have worked but somehow did. "This is becoming a pattern," Sareth observed, her tone suggesting she wasn't entirely opposed to the development. "Perhaps we should file official collaboration requests, make this arrangement legitimate rather than maintained through strategic paperwork omission. That would require explaining how we started collaborating, which means explaining the first storm, the shelter, the violations of first contact protocols." Marcus paused. "Though at this point, we're probably creating more violations by continuing to omit everything from reports." A compelling argument for honesty. Sareth's ears rotated in the pattern Marcus had learned meant amusement. "Or for maintaining current arrangement until bureaucracy forces our hand. I am uncertain which approach creates fewer complications. Let's start with telling our respective administrators that we're conducting joint surveys. Leave out the part about how we met, focus on the data quality improvements." Marcus grinned. "Bureaucracies love efficiency, we're just being efficient. Efficient through cross-species cooperation developed during storm shelter incident we're not mentioning," Sareth added. "This is either brilliant or will create diplomatic incident, possibly both." The storm passed more quickly than the one that had brought them together. just a brief violent interlude rather than days-long siege. Before Sareth left, she turned to Marcus with an expression that suggested she was considering something significant. "My people have a tradition," she said carefully. "When surveyors working remote territories develop partnerships that improve their work, they may request formal team assignment. It would require approval from both our cultures, explanations about how partnership formed, but it would legitimize our collaboration." Marcus's heart did something complicated. "You want to make this official, permanent. I want to stop pretending that maintaining separate territories while constantly meeting at midpoints is sustainable long-term." She stepped closer, and her hand found his, the first time they'd touched deliberately since the storm. "I want to acknowledge that the storm brought gifts, and I am grateful for those gifts even if they complicate cultural expectations." Marcus looked at their joined hands, human and Valdrani, different physiologies finding common ground through simple touch. "Me too. Though we should probably figure out how to explain this to people who think first contact should involve more formal protocols and less emergency weather events." "We'll improvise," Sareth said. "Like we've improvised everything else. One small connection at a time until the connections become strong enough to weather any storm." 3 months later, after extensive paperwork, cultural sensitivity reviews, and Administrator Chen's resigned acceptance that Marcus had accidentally started interspecies cooperation through bureaucratic rebellion, they received formal approval for joint assignment. Forward Station and the Valdrani Regional Authority issued careful statements about experimental cooperation initiatives and data sharing agreements that made the whole thing sound planned rather than the result of a storm and 2 people who chose connection over isolation. Marcus and Sareth established a shared survey station, larger than his original shelter, incorporating both human and Valdrani design elements, positioned at a midpoint between their territories. They conducted their surveys together now, combining methodologies and building comprehensive databases that neither culture could have achieved separately. On clear nights, they sat outside the station watching the crystal forests catch starlight, 2 surveyors from different worlds who'd learned that sometimes survival meant accepting help from unexpected sources, and sometimes connection formed best not through careful planning, but through storms that forced people to open their doors and see what walked in from the cold. "Do you regret it?" Sareth asked one evening, her voice carrying through the thin atmosphere, "choosing to open your door that first time?" Marcus thought about months of isolation, about the moment he'd heard desperate pounding, and made a choice that violated protocols but felt right anyway. "No, best storm I've ever weathered." Sareth's laugh was musical in the night air. "Let us hope we weather many more together, Marcus, though perhaps with less desperate pounding on doors and more planned cooperation. Where's the fun in planning?" The crystal forest sang in the wind, and 2 surveyors from different species continued their work together, building understanding one shared observation at a time, proof that sometimes the best first contact happened accidentally, between 2 people who chose to weather storms together rather than alone.